All right, so how many of you have a dog? All right, some of you. Now, out of those of you with dogs, who has something more like a German Shepherd or a Husky? Okay, some of you, that's great. So for those of you with something like a Husky or a German Shepherd, think of something that looks like that ordinary house pet. All right, now I'm hoping you are thinking of the mighty wolf. Now, when you are looking at this particular animal, you are basically looking at a primitive form of your dog. So how do we get from this to an abomination of the species that you put in a little dress? Well, that took a lot of time. So thousands of years ago, when we were scratching our heads and beating each other with sticks, we would eventually end up domesticating wolves and creating what we now call a dog, that we just say, hey, you want to go and play? But eventually, after a long time, people started to come up with stories like the Big Bad Wolf or Little Red Riding Hood, and that began to demonize what was sitting right in front of us, just in a completely different way. Thankfully, not everyone back in history thought that wolves were bad. For example, Romulus and Remus, they founded Rome, which contributed to Western culture. And without Rome, without Romulus and Remus being raised by that one wolf, Western civilization, America, would not be what it is now. And ironically, the father of Romulus and Remus, Mars, was the Roman god of war, and one of his symbols was actually a wolf. Now, in the early 1600s, when Europeans first came to North America to stay and colonize it, they eventually began shooting wolves on sight because of the stories they'd heard as children. And growing up in that environment, being told wolves are bad, that triggered a crazy mass killing that would continue for the next 2.5 centuries. Now, in the 1870s, Theodore Roosevelt, before he was elected president, and conservationist John Muir joined forces to create something called a national park. And in the 1870s, no one had ever thought of setting aside land for industrialization and keeping it natural. And eventually, a place named after all the sulfur that was there became the first national park in world history, and that was Yellowstone. And in the early 1900s, when the park was finally being established, most settlers in the area thought wolves were something different, that they'd attack their cows or their sheep and cause problems. So in 1915, the National Park Service introduced sarcoptic mange, this little mite, into the coyote population in Yellowstone. Now, sarcoptic mange, what it does is it burrows under the skin of an animal and it causes irritation. So the animal will literally scratch its fur off, and during the harsh winters in Yellowstone, it will die because it freezes to death. Now, how does giving it to the coyotes affect the wolves? Well, as you can see here, wolves and coyotes come into contact quite frequently. And in 1926, this wolf here on the right was the last wolf in Yellowstone, and it was actually shot by the National Park Service. Now, here are two different range maps of the wolf population and the complete utter destruction that Americans caused over this time period was absolutely astounding. Now, shortly after the wolves were exterminated, coyote numbers quickly rose drastically, and only 1 out of every 10 puppy coyotes would survive every year because there was not enough food to go around. And because wolves were not keeping elk and bison in check, the herds would grow too large and would tear up the ground and cause erosion by grazing on riverbank plants, which help create beaver ponds, which are very biodiverse habitats. Now, luckily, in 1995 and 1996, 31 Canadian wolves were captured by the Yellowstone team and brought back to the park. And they were held in chain link pens for a couple of weeks to get acclimated. And eventually, once the groups all were released from their pens, they left the park for a short time, but all of them returned safely, and the park now has a bounding wolf population. Now, a lot of people will tell you that wolves are vicious, cruel monsters that'll kill indiscriminately, but that's just not true. Wolves have been proven to have very deep emotional bondings to each other and very loving, caring creatures. And a perfect example of this happened in 2004. So this particular wolf, when he was a puppy, was very interesting, but as he grew older, he had met a young female, and they had a happy family together. And in 2004, the alpha female, which is up top, she was killed by a rival pack. Now, her partner mourned her death by going to the place where they first met, in this picture here, and he sat there and he howled for 2 weeks without stopping. Yes, he stopped to breathe, but he only came down to do a to-go order with food the rest of the pack had brought him, or to get a drink of water. And then he'd go right back to where he just sat and howled. And finally, in the later part of the year, the old chief, as he was lovingly called, decided to give up. And he went to the same spot where he cried his heart out, and he laid down and died. And it was theorized after his death that he had never fully recovered from the death of his partner. So it was said he died of a broken heart. Now, I'm sure some of my classmates in here remember the 4th grade science project for Mr. Dote, the Scientist Showcase. So I decided I wanted to be Dr. Douglas W. Smith, and he was the head of the wolf project in Yellowstone National Park. And in order to figure out as much as I could about the situation and about who I was supposed to be, I actually called Dr. Smith, and we talked for quite a while, and I went into my project as prepared as could be. But another scientist I contacted during this process was Dr. James Halfpenny, and he spent the last 25 years making charts of the wolves in Yellowstone National Park for the tourists. And he actually told me nearing the end of our conversation, whenever you're in Yellowstone, just give me a call and we'll see if we can meet. And when I was in 5th grade, my parents took me on a trip to Yellowstone, and we actually met with Dr. Halfpenny. And so imagine his face when he gets this call from an 11-year-old with crazy long hair saying, "Hi, want to have dinner with us?" So actually he accepted, and he took us to his office in Gardner, Montana, where he actually keeps plaster footprints of bears, Bigfoots, or wolves, and anything else you can find in North America. So the fact that an adult took time out of his busy schedule, making charts and whatnot, decided he wanted to hang out with this little kid. And that was just really fantastic. And eventually, when I returned back to Texas, I decided I wanted to learn even more until I exhausted all of my resources. And this most recent New Year's, my family journeyed to Yellowstone again during the winter, and we actually saw an entire pack of 8. And the first day, we were guided by a professional biologist, and we actually saw the entire pack on a carcass and then march up a hillside. Then the next day, we come back to the same spot, and this time we find them howling. And I know it sounds like a Hollywood movie scene, but I stood, turned my head up at the sky, and just closed my eyes, and it was absolutely fantastic. And this whole experience has been a really fun time. It's just been fantastic. And now today I've told you that wolves have played an important part in human civilization, how we would not be what we are now without them. And if I were to ask you to go and shoot your dog, would you do it? Probably not. So next time that you think of the big bad wolf, just don't continue with it. Just know, because that is wrong, and we've proven that time and again. Thank you.